Good morning, freshmen. Happy Tuesday. So we are going to shift gears a little bit. We were talking about realism, of course, last two class periods. And again, I apologize that we're having to move so quickly through them, but we're only going to get to spend a couple days on each one of the rest of them. So we have realism, modernism, and contemporary next. Um, Modernism is coming up, and so just kind of again transition between why these things might have transitioned at all is because major events happen, people change their opinions about what's important, and suddenly people want different things, and the writers are all too happy to accommodate that. So, realism went up to the First World War. Of course, the next one you can assume goes to beyond the First World War, and that essentially puts us in between the world wars, okay, or actually around the end of the First World War up to the end of the Second World War. So you can imagine that was a pretty difficult time, right? People were struggling. This was around the time of the Great Depression, around the time of the Dust Bowl, which was a huge farming, I don't know, pandemic. It wasn't a virus, but like an apocalyptic situation for farmers in the Midwest. So very hard times, right? So going back to realism here, we're talking about the truer type of literature. They wanted to reject Romanticism. You can see these things kind of have an ebb and flow. So when we get to modernism, people want something a little different. They're kind of sick of the true stuff. They want to return to symbols a little bit. But instead of like a physical symbol, like a black cat, for example, that we had in the Romantic period from Edgar Allan Poe, we instead start to look at like emotional symbols, right? So things like grief, regret, and fear are all big deals in the modernism period. Those were heavy on people's minds. That was a way of a cathartic way of dealing with issues, meaning like a way to release some emotion by reading through somebody else's conflicts. It was a way to kind of get rid of your own. But this is also a pretty important time in literature in general. This was a time of lots of change as far as the rise of feminism, the rise of minorities having a voice, and so we start to see a lot more minority voices, a lot more female voices than we did in the past. Kate Chopin, was pretty radical for her time in the realism period, but she was still like one of the first feminist writers. By the time modernism comes around, there's all kinds of them, right? And they're all doing like really cool things. So a lot of names that you may or may not recognize. Ernest Hemingway, we'll read one of his things on Friday. F. Scott Fitzgerald, he wrote The Great Gatsby. William Faulkner, Arthur Miller, Robert Frost, we've actually read some of his poetry already. And Langston Hughes, we've read some of his poetry already. So lots of like more familiar names. People also started to mess with style. They started to experiment a lot more. So we start to see stories that don't follow a traditional pattern. We start to see, dialogue that doesn't have quotation marks or something like that. Those are all like kind of interesting and weird things. They were just kind of seeing what worked and seeing what didn't. And they weren't too worried about the rules, so to speak. So we're getting into some of the modernism poetry today. And I will post these into the OneNote system. So I've actually got a lot to pick from, but I'm going to give you four. And they're all fairly short. I'd like you to read all of them and then pick one to kind of settle into to answer your questions for in the OneNote, in Microsoft Teams. So this one's called Advice to a Girl by Sarah Teasdale. Very short, right? Do not go gentle into that good night. If you are a rap fan, then you might notice some phrases that you probably didn't realize came from poetry. Hills Like White Elephants we'll read on Friday. Let's see, where's the other one? The Road Not Taken. We have read before. I'll show you this. This is not going to be one of your four, but it's The Two Roads Diverge in a Yellow Wood. And this is the one that ends with, I took the one less traveled by and it's made all the difference. So, right, we're getting into some really popular stuff here, stuff that everybody knows. Theme for English B was another one that we've read already. About Langston Hughes, who was a black student, and asking, is it going to be true if I actually write down what I believe is my truth? That's a really cool poem as well. The other two that I'm going to have in the system are one by William Carlos Williams, who wrote the one about the red wheelbarrow. Remember, it was only like 3 lines long. He's a really cool poet. Here is his poem. That's the whole thing, right? So think about like the ways that that is messing with grammar and the rules essentially. That's not a traditional poem at all. And then finally, one called Those Winter Sundays. This may be one of my all-time favorite poems of all time. I know I keep saying that, but I wouldn't give you bad stuff to read, so a lot of these are my favorites. This is a very cool poem. So you're going to read all 4 of those. Pick one that you like and one that you'd like to kind of mess with for a little bit and think about. And then that's what I want you to respond with in Microsoft Teams. The second thing that we're going to talk about is that today we're going to start, and the reason that we're doing poetry is to save some time for today, but today we're going to start on our final project for the school year. And I'm calling it a project, but it's really not that big of a deal, right? It's going to be difficult, but it's not like something that we're going to spend weeks and weeks on because we just don't have that kind of time. So here is the goal, all right? While we're reading some of these stories in the background, while we're looking at a whole bunch of different ways of writing stories, we're going to be starting a new story of our own, okay? It's going to be very short, 2 to 3 pages. In literature circles, that's called flash fiction. So it happens very quickly, which means that you kind of have to start with things like in medias res. You have to develop characters very quickly, meaning like show what kind of person they are. You may only have 2 or 3 different characters. You have to decide like what's the most important thing. Am I trying to build plot here? Like, am I trying to show action, or am I trying to show the way that a relationship happened, or a way that a relationship broke down, or something like that, right? Either way, whether you have an action story or a relationship story or a space alien story, I don't care. I want to see the characters developed. I want to see how they deal with that situation. I don't care about a character who's like, I don't know, like a Die Hard kind of character or a Fast and Furious kind of character where they're just like, things are just getting exploded behind them the whole time. And, that's fine. It's kind of fun to watch. But if there's not a character to care about in that situation, then I lose all interest. So I'm happy to have, you have free reign on what you want to write about, and it can be as out there as you want. I'm okay with any of that. But the real goal of this is to practice how you build a character that your reader will care about, right? And how do you do that in 2 to 3 pages? That's really tough to do. I'm going to post an example of one of mine and in the OneNote as well that you can take a look at and kind of get some maybe inspiration for. Likewise, you can also take the short story, the first page thing that you started on, and build off of that. If you're happy with that, you can modify it too. If you don't want to stick with the bank robbery thing, but you kind of like the character or whatever it is, then you can change all of that stuff. So the goal is to have that first draft done by Friday, and then next Monday we're going to get in small groups and try to improve those, which is a very common thing you do in a writing class. So everybody reads everybody else's stories. You won't read everybody's. You'll just read your small groups, and then we give feedback to try to build those up. Okay, and that'll be the project. We'll turn that in not this Friday, but the following Friday for the final draft. This Friday will be the first draft. Okay, so I'd like you to start working on that today after you do the poetry thing. Okay, if you have any questions, please let me know. And until then, take care. Bye-bye.